Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known. Volume 2, Rise of the First World Teacher, with your host, Dr. James Yogadhi Weldon. Good morning. This is Dr. James Weldon Yogadhi from Heavenly Mountain Lodge in Boone, North Carolina, home of the Art of Living Retreat Center, one of the largest such communities and facilities outside of India and the world. We're continuing our discussion of my autobiography from my book. This is the second book we're discussing, called The Rise of the First World Teacher. My first trip to India, found myself quite by accident traveling with Sri Ravi Shankar in Malaysia. Quite an interesting trip by accident after being there 4.5 months in India. The day that I flew out, it turns out the founder of the Art of Living was flying into Kuala Lumpur at the same time. And I had a chance to travel with him. Such a being really has tremendous energy, and sitting in the car behind him, literally, that experience was very, very strong. But he was in those days, of course, that group and organization was quite small. A short time later, in our traveling in Malaysia, we arrived at the hotel. There was an advanced program going on, meditation, called an advanced course. And I remember standing in that hall there in Malaysia, and there was about 100 people in that advanced program with Sri. And I was sitting there at the back of the meeting hall, and I actually was praying that maybe someday I might be sitting in the back of the hall with 1 million people, millions of people in front of me. I was really seeing that. Sometimes my intuition is better than I suspect. Let that day be that someday I'll be a gathering of perhaps millions of people. And I'm telling you, that day has come to pass in more ways than I could ever imagine at the time, in spite of the fact that now hundreds of millions of people have been touched by the Art of Living Foundation and Sri Ravi Shankar's work around the world. Still, he finds a way to maintain a relationship with so many people. And he showed me this during my first trip to India. Often I wonder, and perhaps those of you that have had a chance to see him and be around him closer, why he does what he does. I don't understand. The cause of the action of the enlightened mind is really beyond the consciousness. One time that I needed to talk to him, I was going through some business difficulty in the time. It seemed really important that we should speak. And as I stood on one side of the room, feeling this urgency, I walked across the room towards him, and he turned and walked in the other direction. So I turned around and walked to the other side of the room to head him off. And again, he turned away and walked in the other direction. And no matter how much I tried to get up and catch up with him, I just couldn't do it. And finally, I sat with that situation and was with it, went into myself, and I understood that most of our, quote, urgencies in our life resolve themselves. And I discovered how closely he had actually been watching my life when he was appearing to ignore me. We made our way actually to Singapore for another series of public events. And as we crossed the border, the perfection of everything in Singapore totally surprised me. I really didn't know about you. I didn't realize that one family and group of families have been controlling that small country for some years, a very strict. If you've ever been there, you understand what I'm talking about. For me, seeing Singapore for the first time is like, walking into a huge Star Trek movie set. Everything is so modern. There's no dilapidated buildings or signs or poverty anywhere. And almost every part of the country is, landscaped perfectly. Even the motorways are covered with hanging plants and flowers. And many of the participants in the recent events course in Malaysia are also from nearby Singapore. And on the way to Singapore, I hear the whole story from them. And they're saying Singapore is unique because of the small land area and very high standard of living. Everything is well cared for. there's not enough land for everyone to build here, so most of the construction goes straight up. I looked out the car in every direction. There were huge, buildings, gleaming buildings. And you might be surprised, for example, they were saying at the cost to own a car here, taxes for a car can be more than 50,000 American dollars, just the taxes. I don't know what it is now, but many people take the public transportation for this reason. Some areas and towns are restricted by fee. So if you want to travel there, you have to pay a toll each time you go there, especially during peak traffic times. And there's a monetary fine for every single thing you can imagine. They said our drug laws, for example, are really strict, and sometimes with life imprisonment or even more severe penalties being imposed for that crime. And so crime is very low. So as we arrive in Singapore, Sri settles into his hotel. And as soon as I get in my room, I get an urgent call from him. Someone comes in and he says, Gurji wants to talk to you, has something to tell you. And I walk into the meeting and Sri says, he just turns to me and he says, oh, it's nothing. It'll be okay. Just a little cut. And then he points to his right eyebrow. He said, and that's all. He said, it'll be okay. Don't worry. Just a little cut. And I walk out of the room wondering, what in the world could this possibly be? And then a little while later, another friend comes to see me and says, oh, Yogadhi, we just heard recently that Rama, my wife, Sri had actually given her that name by that time, Rama or Lynn, has been in an accident. You remember in the last story, she wanted to go to South India, and I was feeling nervous about that. Sri would tell her to come with you, and then he would tell her when she asked, if you really want to go, you can go. He would tell us different things. This gentleman said her taxi, was hit by a bus, and that Sri knew immediately that she'd been in an accident, and actually told me what had happened, as far as I can tell, before it happened. I immediately thought back when I was in Bangalore with Rama, and we rode in the taxi and were discussing my concerns about her wanting to go south. And I said, no, you shouldn't go. And I even asked Sri, and he says, well, you can tell Rama not to go. And the next day, she asked him about the trip. He would say, if you really want to go, you can go. And I was wondering why he would tell us opposite things. Since we had met, my wife and I, about 20 years ago, of course, we were married now, I always had some concern that there might be some dangerous times in her life. Her younger sister passed away from her when she was an aneurysm when she was quite young. And she was actually, her younger sister was pregnant. And that's actually one of the reasons why we never had children, because I felt that there was a risk for her. And in one intuitive dream, at one point in the past, it was just an experience. I saw that the top of her head was cut in a specific way, had ended her life in that dream. And during these few moments, that memory again came to my mind. And I have over the years seen that the enlightened mind can foresee the coming karma. And in many cases, a being like Sri can lessen its negative effects. This is one of the secret benefits of being associated with a high consciousness like that. And I'd heard Sri talk about this once when he said that little can be done about the karma, the actions that have already manifested in our life are manifesting, but there are certain things that have not yet come up that actually can be altered. So once the seeds of the past actions kind of come up, there's little that can be done. So if you've got a broken leg or some problem and it's already there, difficult. But in simplest terms, once we created debt by borrowing money on a credit card, then we'll have to pay it back. But a being living the enlightened mind can lessen the amount of that debt by sharing, if you will, some of the spiritual wealth with us so that the outcomes of our negative actions can be less devastating. And this is what had happened in that case, I do believe, to this day. And I do have a picture in my book. Rama, my wife, and she's all black and blue from this accident. Literally, she was sitting on the side of the road in a taxi, and one of these giant metal buses, Indian bus, careened in her taxi, pinned her up against the front. And Sri once told a story to kind of illustrate the karma. He said, in this story, our guru is traveling with 3 of his disciples in the woods on the way to a festival. And suddenly the master picks up a stick from the ground and strikes one of the students over the head with it. And the other student who watches this is, the other 2 are just absolutely astonished by the actions of, and they can't imagine how their spiritual master could do such a thing for no apparent reason, but they say nothing. And as the day goes on, all of them become a little bit more agitated by this. They're wondering if maybe he'll pick up a stick and whack them with it. So during the afternoon on that trip, it begins to rain heavily. As the group moves to wait under a nearby tree for the rain to subside, the master holds out his arms and says, no, don't go under this tree, go under this other tree. Let's wait under this other tree instead. And after a few minutes, the rain stops, but not before a huge branch breaks from the nearby tree and falls exactly where this disciple that was struck by the wood stick by the master, where he stood. And so everyone realizes that if they had waited under that tree, it's very likely, this student would have been killed. And then the master speaks to the disciple he had hit so hard savagely with the stick. He says, it was your destiny to be killed under this other tree. But it was by the grace of the divine, I was given the foreknowledge of this event. And I could not avoid the karma of that blow from the tree, but it didn't have to result in the end of your life. And he says, when I stuck you with the stick, the karma of those actions was complete. So there was no other way to save your life. I really believe that to this day, this is exactly what happened with Rama. I had foreseen a little bit the probable death with some intuition, with the pragya, due to some kind of blow to her head. I didn't know where it would occur when. And obviously I wasn't sure that that was the case. And Sri had told me in advance for a trip to Kerala, Yogadhi, follow your intuition and tell her not to go. He would actually say that. And yet he would tell my wife that she can choose to go south, knowing that if she follows her own destiny and karma. He decided to go south to Kerala in spite of my advice. When the accident occurs, Sri actually immediately asked to see me. I'm amazed at how he could be so skillful in letting me know about this accident. You see, first, he tells me the result of the accident, this unknown karma, and not to worry, that everything is okay, that something has happened to her. He didn't say her name. He says, oh, don't worry, just a little cut. Yogadhi, it's okay, just a little cut. And he pointed actually to his eye. He didn't even say her name at that time. I left the room in Singapore not knowing that there has been a car accident at all, wondered, what is he talking about? All I know is that everything is all right. Afterward, I'm told what happened. And this friend comes to me after I leave the room with Sri and says, there's been a lawnmower accident. You see, I had already gotten over the concern that she was going to be even okay, even before I knew there was a car accident at all. Can you imagine such skill? It boggles the mind. He didn't even use the word cut, but I kind of heard it in my mind. So later that evening, Rama, who's now in South India in the Kerala region, calls me and says that she's been involved in an accident. She and her friend were waiting, meditating in a taxi parked by the side of the road. And a huge Indian bus smashes into the taxi, and she's pinned all the way up against the dashboard. The car was mostly crushed, suffering a significant cut just above her left eye. And I learned all the details. See this accident as a lesson, a test of her faith, as well as the end of a big karma cycle for her. Since the day of our marriage, Rama had always had a fear of abandonment. We remember the emotions generally of the past. We don't really know the circumstances. If you know about my story here, if you've had a chance to read the first book, you know that in that past life when we were together, I did die first in Tibet, kind of leaving her on her own. And we often joke that we had an agreement in this life that this won't happen in this incarnation. She's actually of 5 years older than me. I actually believe that that's true. So although it's a joke, I really believe it's true. You see, she's 5 years older than I am, and the plan is that I think she'll finish her life before me. This is what we believe. So she sends me the pictures of her accident, and she's all black and blue from that event. It's absolutely amazing. She's grinning ear to ear. On that journey and that accident, her passport, all her money, credit cards, and everything was taken. Her taxi was hit by a bus, but in spite of this, everything was taken care of. At the accident, a huge crowd of many people gathered, many trying to pull her out of the crumpled taxi, and she's bleeding from the cut in her head. And at that moment, someone shows up to take her to the hospital. Without any money or identification, she receives treatment in an absolutely beautiful Ayurvedic center on the beach. Now she's getting massages and natural therapy, and that's what she went for. And it's Rama's lesson at this point, I believe, to face her worst fears of being alone without any means, to enable her to realize that she's really protected at every moment. This is so cool, guys. This is so cool for me to see this. This accident that I believe should have been fatal only leaves a small scar under her eye. And as I tell her story, I marvel and wonder about what kind of consciousness is it that can see such pending karma and yet step in to kind of change the result from possibly a probable death to a lesson of love and inspiration. Friends, every one of us must go through the fruit of our past actions. Yet this story shows that there really is an enlightened consciousness, an enlightened mind that can see beyond the veil of time and space. For me, this awareness, I call it something, and I call it Sri Sri. That's what I call it. And I realized at that moment that the enlightened mind, that consciousness, knew that she had this karma. And if this is so, how could he say no to her, since this was her choice? He could suggest, but he would say, if you really want to go, you can go. So you need to think about this a little bit. He could only lessen the negative result of her, just like the story of the master that whacked the individual with the stick. So she got her whack, but the tree didn't fall on her, for example. He certainly took my worry and happiness about this really difficult situation in a way that is absolutely inexplicable. Just by telling me that everything was okay before I knew that there was even an accident. I mean, this is unbelievable. Unbelievable. But this is actually what happened, my friends. This is a really, really interesting chapter. This next chapter is entitled Learning to Communicate Without Words. Learning to communicate without words. And there's a little poem that I'll read here before. What needs to be said cannot be said. What needs to be known cannot be known. What needs to be experienced cannot be experienced. But it can be lived. It can only be lived. It can only be lived. So join me again in a few moments. Really, really deep and powerful lesson in this next section. Thank you for taking a few moments of your day. Again, go out, do something good, help somebody, reach out, and think a little bit about this last story, about overcoming the difficulties in our life and lessening the effects of our past. Our life is long, our life is big, and we certainly all need some help, right? In order to, lessen the things we need to go through. This is the power of grace, and it is a tremendously powerful force in this life. Thank you. I'll talk to you again. Namaste and Shaker. Thanks for joining us in our YouTube channel, books, podcast episodes on living the enlightened life, and autobiography with your host, Dr. James Yogadhi Weldon.